researcher under the South African Research Chair, Cities Law and Environmental Sustainability at the Northwest University. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you to our critical conversation this afternoon on making room for corporate governance of South African cities in the public law relationship. Our speaker for this afternoon is Professor Marius Pieterse from the University of Witwatersrand. Ladies and gentlemen, while we endeavor to keep our sessions very informal as possible, I would like to draw your attention to a few housekeeping rules. Please be advised to switch off your cameras to save data. Also be advised to remain muted unless you are asked to unmute if you're answering or asking a question. Please try as far as possible to use the chat function to pose questions. And also please note that we are going to be recording this session and a register is going to be taken for auditing purposes. Now, without wasting much time, I hand over the floor to Professor Anel du Plessis to give us a background on CLES as well as the critical conversation series.
Thank you very much, Chantal, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure having you all virtually at our last Critical Convo for 2021. We've had 2 others this year. We aim at 3 a year. And I was quickly looking at the list of participants to see whether or not there might be someone who's not familiar with the chair. And I can, for the first time, say that I think everyone in the house are family or friends of CLES in some way or the other. So I'm not going to say much about the chair. And if perhaps I've missed a name of someone that is new to the family, we are, all of us organizing this event are based in Potchefstroom at the South African Research Chair in Cities, Law and Environmental Sustainability that is funded by the National Research Foundation of South Africa. And we work at different levels: practical, normative, conceptual, theoretical, case study based on different aspects of urban law and governance. And we always invite participation from people of different disciplines and sectors. And this session really is aimed at engagement. And for those of you who have not met Prof. Marius Pieterse or have not read his work, he is an outstanding scholar, and I know that he's now rolling his eyes by me saying this, but I mean it. He is probably one of the best urban law scholars that Africa has produced so far. And we hope at CLES that some of the youngsters will follow in his footsteps. But Marius, also from my side, welcome and thank you for this afternoon. I look forward to your presentation. Chantal omitted a very important 2 words when she read your title. It's all about corporate co-governance, and a lot is being written about co-governance in governance in the city and urban context, but not necessarily from a corporate perspective, and not much work on this has been done, if any, in the South African context. So I will be facilitating the questions after your speech, and I'm going to hand over to Chantal first, but I invite everyone, as you think of a response or think of a question, please put it in the chat so long. I will also give opportunity for personal questions, and you can then show your face if you like to, or you can just unmute with the raise of a hand later on. And please don't feel intimidated by Prof. Pieterse, even though he is as smart as I indicated. I know that he's working on a paper also, and that he invites comments and inputs. So please don't be shy, and let's have a conversation in as far as this, what I now call stupid virtual setup, is allowing us to. So thank you, everyone. Looking forward to this session. And Chantal, over to you, unless we can go straight into Prof. Marius's talk.
Thank you very much, Prof. Ladies and gentlemen, at this juncture, it is my singular honor to introduce you to Professor Marius Pieterse, Prof teaches constitutional law and human rights law at the University of Witwatersrand School of Law. He holds a B2 rating from the National Research Foundation, and his research predominantly focuses on urban governance, local government law, and the realization of socio-economic rights in the urban context. Now, Professor Marius is an author of various pieces of literature, including books, a large number of peer-reviewed articles that revolve around, amongst other things, the right to health, urban governance, rights-based litigation, as well as social justice. Welcome, Prof. We look forward to your insights this afternoon, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chantal, and hello, everyone, and thank you also for your kind, if somewhat overblown words, Anal. Thanks for having me. I'm always very grateful to be associated in some way with CLES and for all of our interactions and CLES's support. Whilst I probably struggle to share my screen, although it actually looks like I've succeeded, let me apologize in advance. Apart from being all feverish since my second vaccination yesterday, I also did a practice run of this talk about an hour ago, and it dawned on me how incredibly abstract and confusing it was. But it's because I'm presenting to you today my thoughts on a topic that keeps overwhelming me. It's about how to steer businesses that are directly or indirectly involved in urban governance towards progressive common societal goals that ultimately benefit urban residents. And this began as a project looking at the role of large industrial businesses dominating some of South Africa's secondary cities and towns. But it keeps spinning into something bigger and bigger and bigger. And so today you are hearing what seems to be the third of 3 theoretical papers underlying the broader project. And before I continue, can I just have some indication that you can actually see my screen?
We can see your screen, we can see you, and we hear you well. Thanks, Marius.
Thank you, Anal. So today's presentation then focuses on, hopefully, on the application and development of concepts in South African constitutional and human rights judgments to corporate co-governance of South African cities. But the background for my research is this conventional and vastly oversimplified picture of the changing role of the national state under globalization, which holds that public power over the last few decades has been surrendered by nation states, both upwards to supranational institutions and processes, downwards through devolution to local governments, often especially in urban areas, and then from there outwards to a range of non-state actors with either power over urban governance processes and or power to shape urban space. And in relation to this outward fragmentation of state power, there is often spoken about a shift from government to governance, especially in an urban context, where urban space is said to be governed through networks, relationships, and interactions between complexity of actors in ways that continuously shift both over time and between places, between cities, between different functions, processes, and geographical spaces within a single city, and so on. And where governance happens with and through various sources of hard and soft law and power, which are channeled through a variety of tools and instruments, private-public partnerships, public law, private law, contract, integrated development planning vehicles, and so on. And the role of local government in this fluid matrix, if you will, is said to be a coordinating and steering one, of herding this plethora of public and private interests at stake in the city and directing them towards the achievements of some common good be that the SDGs, the achievements of human rights, or some sort of locally or nationally defined developmental ideals. I'll say more about this later. And so I'm interested in how we legally conceive of and frame and enable the steering role of local government, specifically in relation to then businesses that are involved in urban governance as they have always been. From the days of company towns run by and for mining companies and logging companies and so on, where the company used to be the local government for a town. In South Africa, we have several examples of this. CLES and other small towns in the Northern Capes have been run by De Beers for many decades. Welkom in the Free State was initially run by Anglo and so on. But in today's secondary cities or towns, we often find that the economy is dominated by a single industry. I'm thinking of the Vaal Triangle, Rustenburg, Carletonville. We find companies positioned in those cities and towns as sort of senior development partners of local government. And they effectively call the shots in relation to various aspects of urban governance. It's the same kind of thing in cities where multinationals are major investors, like in the cases of the car manufacturers in our Eastern Cape cities. There's sort of similar dynamics there mixed with the governance of special economic zones as nationally governed spaces within cities. And then there are a multitude of arrangements in big and small places where corporates have a say in governing urban processes, like in cases where service delivery is outsourced or privatized, and then also urban places. For example, where companies have a say in governing city improvement districts or business improvement districts in, for example, Joburg and Cape Town. So that in bigger cities, we kind of find the city turning into this patchwork of different area-specific governance arrangements with a different mix of private actors involved, a different mix of underlying laws and norms, and then whereas in smaller places, especially where local government lacks capacity and resources, there's sort of more of a one-way arrangement with governance often heavily influenced by or skewed towards the interests of the larger corporates. Urban law then, in its various manifestations, is key to shaping the steering role of local government vis-a-vis all those corporate stakeholders, either in the city or in the different parts of the city. And so my bigger project claims to look at local government's legal powers, functions, and responsibilities, alongside the mechanics of devolution and intergovernmental relations, as well as to the sort of government's tools, instruments, and resources at local government's disposal, and the capacities that they possess, or in the case of private partners, the capacities that they have the power to leverage or co-opt. The spaces and processes within which steering decisions are taken, who gets to participate in these spaces and processes, how the processes and spaces slot into the various networks and relationships at play, and so on and so on. But today I want to focus only, he says confidently, on the role of human rights law. First, as normative standards for urban governance and co-governance, and secondly, as the sort of main site of accountability for urban governance actors, both the state actors and the non-state actors. And globally, we find that human rights law is actually struggling to assert itself in the urban governance space. It's yielding a lot of normative force to environmental and development law, like, for instance, the SDGs. And there are several reasons for this. International human rights law still holds itself forth as universal in its application in all contexts. An application that is very top-down, centered on the obligations of state actors at a national level and overwhelmingly vertical. International human rights law is only incidentally concerned with local government, only indirectly concerned and binding on non-state actors, and it's still caught in a very unhelpful distinction between civil and political and socioeconomic rights, which collapses in cities. And all of this diminishes its usefulness in the context of contemporary urban governance, where my argument is that we need to rethink especially human rights law's application to corporate actors, its application to local government, and then its enforcement against corporate actors with and by local government. And current international law relating to the human rights obligations of business remains predominantly centered on the sort of negative obligation to respect human rights and not to do or to be complicit in any harm understood typically in a very civil and political rights sense. And human rights in this context remain enforced predominantly through soft law and self-regulation around, for instance, corporate social responsibility. And there are a number of sort of fundamental questions that remain to be answered or even consistently asked in this context. Questions pertaining to, for instance, the nature and objectives and beneficiaries of corporate social responsibility, who gets to benefit, who gets to define, the legal content and implications of the notion of corporate sphere of influence to which some of the soft law instruments increasingly allude, and indeed the contemporary justifications for profit as a foundational motive of corporate law, which can't be assumed anymore, many people have argued. And there's very little clarity on how this links to traditional public law objectives. Now, what are these public law objectives? In the South African Constitution, they are, among other things, and for my focus today, as you know, spelled out by Section 152 of the South African Constitution, in addition to the rights in the Bill of Rights. And Section 152 is on the screen. It says that the objects of local government are to provide accountable and democratic government to local communities, to ensure sustainable service provision, promote development, promote a healthy and safe environment, and encourage the involvement of communities in their own governance. And then there's subsection 2 saying that municipality must, within its financial and administrative capacity, strive to achieve these objectives. And subsection 2 is obviously broad enough to encompass a local government leveraging this capacity in partnership with its range of non-state actors, as is indeed then operationalized by, for instance, the public-private partnership provisions of the MFMA, the Municipal Systems Act, and so on. Now, when it comes to the interpretation and the judicial interpretation of the section, as we know from the Joseph and Kontwana and other cases, Section 152 works closely with rights in the Bill of Rights, especially the environmental right and socioeconomic rights. And so I'm interested in how those rights shape governance partnerships and the extent to which they then bind the non-state actors that are embroiled in those partnerships. And stepping back again to a sort of international level, several legal systems around the world provide for different forms of horizontal application of human rights against corporate power. In many states, for instance, human rights law applies directly against non-state actors in instances where they explicitly perform state functions, either with or alongside the state. A sort of expansion on or a flipping of the American state action doctrine, which would hold the state accountable for corporate actions in this sort of state action context. In other cases, there are instances where systems allow for corporates to be directly bound by human rights in national constitutions, or where via the state's obligation to protect rights, they bind businesses indirectly through the operation of common or statutory law. There's then also this notion of seepage or value alignment, where rights enter statutory law through interpretation, or they enter common law through its judicial development, which, especially in the fields of contract and property law, can over time change the relationships between states, residents, and then corporates in particular contexts. Now, in South Africa, as we know, the Constitution provides for all 4 of these forms of horizontal application of both civil and socioeconomic rights, although much less developed in relation to socioeconomic rights. And it also explicitly allows for rights to operate differently in different contexts. It applies when applicable, and it even goes so far as to award certain rights to corporates, depending on the context. But there's been relatively little judicial engagement with horizontality and preciously little institutionalization of horizontal rights in the mechanics of urban governance. And I'm not going to go into the details and the depressing distinctions between verticality and direct and indirect horizontality and diagonality and value-based seepage and all of those things today. I've read all the horizontality cases for this work in recent months, and they get more confusing and contradictory and pointless in their navel gazing by the day. But to highlight that from the lots of them viewed together, a few important things in this context seems to be crystallizing, where corporations are involved in governance or intertwined in governance processes, as happened in well-known constitutional court cases like Oil Pay and Black Sash in relation to social security provision. The courts seem to be both prepared to grant them rights in the process, the corporates, but also to hold them responsible for their role in the progressive realization of socioeconomic rights, even above and beyond the terms of their contract, as happened in both Oil Pay and Black Sash. Secondly, there's a wide spectrum in South African law of indirect horizontal regulation of corporate activity and social responsibility, both in legislation, especially in environmental and mining legislation, like the social and labor plans in terms of the mining legislation, are some of the most radical manifestations of horizontal social rights in the world, on paper in any event, but also in common law development, where years of rights-based adjudication around housing and so on have altered the operation of both property and, to a lesser extent, contract law, to sort of reposition corporate power in relation to societal interests and the interests of both the state and members of society. But what's more interesting to me is the development of public law concepts in both socioeconomic rights and local government adjudication that we can use, or that can serve as basis and accountability frame, if you will, for co-governance alongside horizontality. Which finally brings me to the title of this talk, this notion of a cluster of public law relationships that was developed by the Constitutional Court in the Joseph case, which you will recall was a case where principles of administrative justice were asserted in electricity provision against city power in Joburg outside of the individual terms of the contract between Joburg and its customers. And where the court looked at the relationality of urban governance as being the bridge between rights in the Bill of Rights and then the developmental objectives of local government in Section 152. Now, I've only begun to think of this, but I like this notion of a cluster of rights because of who can possibly be in it. I like the notion that cluster relationships extend beyond contracts because it links to horizontality jurisprudence and to socioeconomic rights. And I like that it comes together in the public municipal responsibilities because of how this structures municipal steering power. Now, the legal or the jurisprudential content of this cluster is still very much up for grabs. It's only had very sparse development. We know from the case law that the Constitutional Court sees this public law relationship as a way to connect social rights to municipal obligations, both in relation to housing and to urban services that are part of Section 152, though even the ones that are not explicitly enumerated in the Bill of Rights, like electricity and Joseph. We've also seen it interpreted by the High Courts to also involve ESCOM, an organ of state, but outside of local government, although central to urban governance. And it was invoked in the Joe Slovo case, which also involved a private-public property development partnership, although the private developer's place in this cluster wasn't elaborated in Joe Slovo. And we know from Joseph, and I suppose also from Oil Pay, that the public obligations in terms of this relationship can extend beyond the terms of a specific contract. And so this is sort of the question that I want to throw open for discussion by us all today. Is there room in this cluster to sort of include and elaborate in appropriate circumstances and very contextually rights and obligations for non-state actors and specifically corporations that are involved in urban governance? And I list on this final slide some further concepts that have been developed by our courts in socioeconomic rights cases that I feel are sort of ripe for development, and secondly, for giving legal content to this public law relationship in the context of what I'm thinking. Beyond the sort of state action type verticality and the reconfiguration of rights and duties under contract and property law, I'm thinking here of the joinder cases and eviction matters or disputes where courts have found municipalities had to be joined as public actors in private disputes implicating housing rights. And I'm wondering about the possibility of joinder in a broader range of cases and involving a broader range of actors, where you join private actors to disputes where the private actors also have an impact on the exercise of rights. I'm also thinking about meaningful engagement, which I believe to be a very valuable concept for urban governance more generally over and above housing. And where the Constitutional Court in the second short Blue Moonlight case sort of left open the question of whether the obligation to engage meaningfully can also be extended to private parties, which I think is interesting. And I'm also thinking of this notion of good constitutional citizenship, which was used by the Constitutional Court in the Merafong versus Anglo Gold case, which it was used to discipline local government, but specifically in its dealings with a private corporate and a powerful corporate, Anglo, which used its own involvement in service delivery in Carltonville as one of the arguments in the case as to why it shouldn't be made to pay extra water tariffs. And I'm wondering whether this notion of good constitutional citizenship can be extended to also cover the actions of corporate governance partners within this broader frame of the Joseph relationship. And yeah, it's all very confusing, but I'd be very interested to know what you think. And thank you for listening.
Sure, Marius, that's a mouthful. Thank you so much. Just earlier this year, I presented actually at this critical convo session on our secondary cities also, and the hollowing out of some, and where we see the pulling out of corporates and the consequences that's causing for urban development in smaller areas, not necessarily the metros. And when I did the research for that piece, I came across the some of the complexities that you've mentioned, but I did not venture at all in going into but how to facilitate this in the context of the Constitution, which is obviously an incredibly important question. We know what our economy depends on in South Africa. We are actually in the grips of especially mineral and other resources and companies exploiting those, but that's what's keeping our economy growing, which is also alluding to that complexity that you started out with. I'm going to invite people to raise their hands. I have a suspicion that others are also just digesting a little bit first, but I've got plenty of questions. But I see that Thomas, he's got a question for you. Thomas, please show your face. Welcome. Also, Thomas is also a previous Critical Convo presenter. Lovely to see you, Thomas.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. And thank you, Professor Pieterse, for your very interesting presentation, which is, yeah, there's a lot to unpack. So I think, I mean, there were 2 points. I can't necessarily remember my second point now. My first point was about, I suppose, who the corporate actor is, and at what point do we regard that corporate actor as having essentially an obligation to enact a good corporate citizen? I mean, so are we talking here about a big company, so to speak, and what do we mean by that? How do you distinguish that from other companies? Maybe in a sort of a small mining town that might be fairly easy to do, but I'm just wondering about how one distinguishes this. I also think it is interesting to think about it in the lens of if you think about a right as both having a right and a duty, that we're developing. You're not necessarily developing that right. You're very much developing what that duty is, I suppose, and who that duty is responsible for, or who is responsible for that duty. And then my second point is the extent to which, if you placing an obligation on a private actor would essentially further deplete the capacities of public actors, in that maybe it might mean that there's less of a, I suppose, pressure on public actors to fulfill their developmental needs. And I suppose part of my question here comes from you know, what we see already, I think, in Johannesburg, in that out of necessity, many corporate actors have taken on some roles of urban services. You know, I'm thinking here of fire services, for example, simply because of the complete of whatever the reasons they are for not renewing fire contracts, etc. That this has necessarily fallen to private actors. So, you know, to what extent does your argument, or to what are the consequences of your argument for the further depletion of the capable state?
Thomas, thanks. And Marius, I would like to add to that the consequences for participatory democracy. So you can respond, and then we will take the next round.
Thanks, Tom and Anal. Who the corporate actor is, I think, would very much differ from context to context. And the trickiness of all of this is to start acknowledging that in the urban governance context, we are dealing with a variety of arrangements within the same sort of overarching system, and that public law, which is used to applying universally, won't be able to in the same way. And so what I'm seeing in the literature is the sort of distinction between power over processes and power to produce space, and that one would give different obligations to different corporates in different circumstances over different times, depending on how much power over a process they have, and then also how formalized that process is, and then what powers it gives them to produce urban space. Because whilst it is true that a lot of corporates do take over these functions precisely because the city can't, and precisely you know, it's not like they do this out of benevolence. The kind of space that is produced through corporate co-governance tends to be the kind of space that serves corporate ends rather than more sort of public ends. And so one will need to figure out a way of sort of doing shifting obligations over time and space that also doesn't overburden a corporate. And I think you're right, Tom, that all of this is about, which is why, I mean, I say my talk is about corporate co-governance, and then I spend most of the slides talking about local government and their role. It's about the capacity of the state to steer and to organize, and then the extent to which the state is capable very much depends the extent to which corporates fulfill this role. I just don't think that when they do in practice that we should pretend that they're not. And I know that that's difficult. And a lot of the work that I've done already in relation to this depends very much on the structures through which, because often there are quite formal structures and governance arrangements. Like if you're on the board of a CID, for example, it depends on who gets to be in the room, and then it depends on who has the decision-making power on that board, and that defines the kind of space that is produced, and it must also define the role that rights play, and how one structures these sort of ad hoc governance arrangements of different urban spaces where there's often a lot of private power involved in relation to conventional participatory processes is very interesting. I've read research in Germany, and it was a comparative piece between Germany and the Netherlands, and then also in South African mining towns about decisions being taken in fora that negotiate contracts, and that those fora are obviously closed to broader participation. They tend to involve the city or the town, and then the sort of development partner, if you will, or the mining company or whoever. And then once that decision is taken, the decision is then taken to the broader public participation forum, but it's presented as having already been taken, and as sort of after the fact consultation. And the contract lawyers are trying to work on all kinds of ways in which one can then sort of start doing public relational contracts with forcing public participation processes into contractual negotiations. But that's a whole other kettle of fish.
Marius, thank you very much. How small is the world and how big is it at the same time? Matt Glasser is also with us. He's also got a question. I'm going to give an opportunity to him now, but I'm also going to make an advertisement because I just so happened earlier this morning to have worked through this book to which you and Matt both contributed, Law and the New Urban Agenda, everyone. So if you don't have it, buy it. Matt, before I give you an opportunity, Marius, I also would like to know from you whether you think public law is the right entry point. Is it not part of, and it's my entry point as well, that's where we come from. But is it not that we should perhaps critically consider the technicalities and the nuts and the bolts in contract law, corporate law, company law, and then work our way back to that cluster of relationships that you've been talking about? And in the same vein, I'm wondering if now, 2020, knowing what's going on, we live in the urban age, whether countries would have written their constitutions differently, because that hard and soft power that you've been referring to very much in the country context sits in the constitution. And the soft power is actually to some extent starting to override hard power in some areas, but the hard power sits in the constitution. So I would like to just hear your reflections on that as well. But let's take Matt's question too, and then you can respond to both. Welcome, Matt. Are you joining us from the US this afternoon?
I am. I'm in Washington, D.C. And thank you, Marius, for a wonderful talk. It's good to see you again. And Anel, I think you could not have given a better introduction to the comment that I wanted to make and the question I wanted to ask about different entry points. As you, I'm sure, know, South Africa's King Committee on Corporate Governance has been at the forefront of thinking about accountability in terms of corporate governance, and to whom is the corporation actually accountable? Is it only shareholders, or does it go beyond that? And the first several iterations of the King Commission report limited themselves to corporations, but the fourth iteration, which came out in 2016, has an appendix in which they explain how, in their view, this should be applied to municipal governance as well. And they specifically sort of cast the council as the board of directors and the citizens as the shareholders. And they essentially take exactly the same principles that they apply to corporations, and they transform them into principles that would apply to municipalities. So to me, this is a very strong source of alignment, if you will, between what the duties of the council and the duties of the corporate board are, and thus, more broadly, what the duties of the local government and what the duties of the corporation are. And I think that is something that, if I were taking a case to court, I would put that front and center and hope that maybe the courts would bite on that, because it's principles based. It's not rules based. And in that way, it goes beyond, Marius, as you say, beyond the letter of the contract, and gets into what the actual obligations are. So I wonder if you've thought about this King report as a potential nexus between the two. And then the other thing I wanted to just mention is that, as you know, cities deal with these when they corporatize their utilities, these issues. And originally, when Johannesburg corporatized all of its entities, it established two different units to manage the relationship with its entities. It had a contract management unit, and that unit was supposed to sort of advocate for the citizens and be sure that they got good services at a reasonable price. And it had a shareholder unit that was supposed to be sure that the entities managed the public assets appropriately and didn't run down the asset base and so on. And it was recognized that there could sometimes be a tension between these two sets of interests. So they established two separate units. Now, more recently, after the last municipal elections, both of those units have been collapsed. And whatever accountability they may have been enforcing seems to have been substantially diluted. But I wonder what you think also about those kinds of specific, because it's not just establishing the principles, it's managing the relationship as time goes on. What you think about the management of the relationship. And thank you very much for a fascinating talk.
Thank you, Matt. Over to you, Marius.
Thank you, Matt. And it's great to see you as well. And thanks, Anel. And as the two of you are speaking, I'm thinking of so many things that I am probably not able to answer any of your amazing questions. Matt, in many ways, what I've tried to do in this paper is kind of the opposites of King. I've only scanned King, and I agree with everything that you say about that as a very useful entry point. But what's notable about King and processes of that and their application to municipal governance is that sort of forms part of this sort of recycling of corporate aims of sort of competitiveness and so on into public law aims. And I'm trying to do the opposite in some ways, to sort of say, how can we translate public law aims into this relationship? But I agree that it is relevant and that it is necessary and that this work needs to do both. I just hope that it's not a separate paper. And then, Anel, yes, the entry point question is a very important one, and I would add property law to that, specifically because often these large corporates are major property holders, especially landowners within the cities and towns, and so that they are often both, they exercise all the rights in property law and pressure through that as landowners on development processes. I'm currently reading about Durban and Tonga Hewlett as both landowner and sort of main development partner, where one has to think through contract and property and company law as portals, and one has to acknowledge it's about breaking down the sort of private law, public law distinction, and one has to acknowledge the public nature of both property and then often of these contracts. Nesta Davidson has done some really interesting work on contract as an urban governance tool, as opposed to, for example, a development plan or so, where one has to start thinking about a contract in far more than just the sort of two parties at hand, sort of at arm's length negotiation kind of thing, to include, for example, participation, to include the relationality of the relationship, that it's going to shift over time, that the terms have to shift over time based on how the company's position changes, the city's position changes, all these things change. I mean, for me, the massive challenge in this project has been to demarcate my focus and not to focus on all of these things at the same time. So I'm sort of trying to look at the specific kinds of law in isolation in relation to this relationship. And so I'm looking at human rights law, and then I want to do something on contract law, although I don't know enough about contract law. Tom and I are doing something together on property law in Durban, and so so
you are just out of control.
I am critically considering all these entry points. I'm just really struggling to consider them all at once.
No, thank you. And I think therefore you should consider writing a book, Marius. No, I think we are pleased with your answers, and that this is so exciting to be able to push you and to ask you, because that also helps eventually, hopefully, in framing your thoughts and anticipating the feedback from the anonymous peer reviewers that will come now. But Marius, we've got a few other questions. We fortunately have another 30 minutes left, more or less. And before I give an opportunity to the others to also pose their questions, I also would like to hear your view on the so-called urban commons, and whether you've read into the notion. And it's not something that many South African scholars have so far really considered. But our understanding of the urban commons speaks to shared access to, shared use, but shared responsibility. And I think that's a notion that underpins the argument that you are trying to make for corporate governance. But let me switch, and I am now on my phone and on my computer, to Chantal, then Melandri, then you can respond, and then we go to you, Andri, and Nonhlanhla.
Thank you very much, Prof. But my question has been addressed when Prof spoke about shifting obligations. So thank you.
All right. Melandri?
Thank you for a very insightful presentation, Prof. Pieterse. It's always wonderful listening to you speak. So my question, I think, has mostly been answered. But I think I was primarily just asking whether, at what point do we get to a point where it becomes bailing out of local governments or of the national and provincial or out of their own duties with regards to addressing, providing services or addressing certain key responsibilities? So at what point do we kind of make that distinction between co-governance and kind of bailing out those responsible for certain duties? Thank you, Prof.
Hey, Melandri. Yes, you're asking the same difficult and tricky question that Thomas asked, which is, at what point is co-governance this good thing, and at what point does it let local government off the hook, and at what point does it then start accelerating the collapse in capacity? Thinking here of towns like Witbank, where the mines are now both polluting the water in the first place and then purifying the water and selling it back to the town because of the breakdown in the town's own capacity to deal with these things. And I actually don't think I have an answer for that yet. I am trying to look at whether and to what extent human rights law can play a role in sort of framing this accountability where it is happening. But like what I think both you and Tom highlight is that this is also still about the accountability of local government, and one has to then also look at the functioning of the current both top-down and bottom-up accountability processes, both in terms of interventions and so on, but then also in terms of participation. And so that links it back to Anel's question. It's a tough question. I'm not sure. Anel, yes, I've done a little bit of urban commons reading, and I think that the urban commons and the social function of property literature and the right to the city literature kind of all do the same thing there. They're all about redefining our notion of what the city is, of what the actors are, and of blurring the public-private distinctions within those, both in terms of who gets to run the city, because there's also all of them also speaks about sort of running the city through participation and bottom-up sort of governance at the same time, and then the role that different actors have to play in this. And I think part of the struggle in a paper like this, and also in a related one that I've done on the structures of co-governance and participation and so on, is precisely that public law concepts, all being a couple of years old now, are struggling to respond to the pressures of urbanization. And that these theories, if you will, are ways in which, or all sort of show up ways in which public law has to change in order to be able to do the kinds of things that I wanted to do. So yes, that is definitely something.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with you. And if you think how you've mentioned Chapter 7 of the Constitution and 156 now, 153, and its connection with the Bill of Rights. And we know how much in the Bill of Rights, the socioeconomic rights at least, depends on infrastructure in our cities. And infrastructure in our country depends on investment by corporates. So the complexity intensifies, definitely so, but let me not take more time. You have generated so much discussion. So Johandri is up next. And then also after her, it is Nonhlanhla. And then it's back to Thomas and back to Matt, in that order. Okay, Marius.
Thank you, Prof, for your presentation. It's really interesting. I just wanted to know, in your view, do you think that our current legal framework sufficiently encapsulate the complexities of certain industries which work with the environment, like mines and fisheries? Does it sufficiently encapsulate the ethical part of the right to be able to carry on the industry in a specific field? For instance, fisheries, you give a vessel the license to fish and so on, but they also it should be accompanied with the ethical responsibility to fish sustainably and not to do more harm to the environment that is currently being done. And the same can be said to mines. They get the right permits and licenses to carry on with mining operations, but in doing so, isn't there an ethical responsibility for them to not to degrade the environment unnecessarily? And does our legal framework make sufficient provision to enforce this ethical responsibility of corporates?
Thanks, Johandri. And Marius, can we have Nonhlanhla's as well?
Yeah.
And then you can answer.
Thank you very much, Professor Nel and Prof. Pieterse. Mine is really not a question, but rather a comment. As I was listening to Prof here, I was reminded of the talk or the lecture that was given last night by Advocate Ngobai Toby, as well as Professor Lynn Fields. And really, for me, this echoed the importance that we have on how there's just so much work that still needs to be done, and how we have the Constitution and how we are reading it right now, it certainly can be extended to ensure really that we achieve a just society. So when Prof. Pieterse was asking a question of how we can really realize these corporate rights that we have, and if we can really extend it to corporations, I certainly then thought it's certainly possible. It all lies in how we really interpret and extend our Constitution, of course, not in an unjust or an oppressive way for our corporations or any other body, but certainly there's still a lot that we can do. So I really enjoyed this talk. Thank you very much, Prof.
Thanks, Nonhlanhla. Marius, you can respond.
Thank you, Nonhlanhla and Johandri. Johandri, that's an excellent question, and the answer is no, I don't think the legal framework is sufficient. I think the examples that you give are precisely part of what appears when everyone starts engaging with this topic, which is that in the time and place where we are at the moment and where the climate is changing, we need to start rethinking the very basis on which we operate, both our companies and our cities, and in this case then both. And I don't think the current legal framework, and I don't think the current status of human rights law, as I've summarized it, is sufficient for that. And it's precisely there then that we need to think, as Nonhlanhla says, about ways in which we can sort of recast all of this, and that then again goes back to Anal and the commons and social functions and so on, which are places where we can start looking for the kind of reconfiguration of all of this that's going to be necessary.
Thanks, Marius. Thomas, you've got a hand up. I saw also Matt's, but it's since down. So Thomas, you can pose your question, and Matt, if I can just get an indication if you still want to pose a question or make an intervention.
No, I'm covered.
Okay, so Thomas and then Peter. I can just perhaps, before Thomas asks his question, the speech that Nonhlanhla just referred to, Marius, was a keynote speech delivered last night at the opening of the Environmental Law Association conference. And Tracy Humby dealt with a very interesting topic, and she also spoke to transformative constitutionalism, and she quoted you and had a very nice picture of you in her slides as well. So Thomas, you are welcome to pose your question, and then we move to Peter, who happens to be the chairperson of the ELA. Thanks.
Yeah, so I think it's what I'm saying is essentially in response to what we've been this conversation. I mean, it would seem that your project is actually less about understanding the way in which a private party could begin to usurp the functions of local government, and more about a recognition that co-governance occurs anyway. And thus how it occurs at multiple levels, both formally and informally, and at various scales, all the way from sort of very local, everyday, street-based uses, all the way up to sort of global multinational corporations. And I think your project is incredibly useful, obviously, in explaining how the Constitution envisages this form of co-governance, and how there is significant space within the South African Constitution for this form of co-governance. And I'm also reminded here about the cabbage bandit story, which I'm sure many of you might know about now in Tshwane. That would seem to be on a smaller scale. But I think our fear is that I guess there is a potential informality in allowing corporate governance to essentially have so much of a sway, and that is, I think, there may be a lack of certainty as to how this could work, how this accountability could work. But then I think, well, maybe it's I mean, I'll go back to the point that I made earlier, that maybe it is about developing the content not of the right, but of the content of the duty, and that the duty and who that duty falls onto will obviously vary according to the particular space, according to the particular role that actor has. So, in other words, it's the duty of the Constitution that becomes that much more flexible rather than the right itself. And that would, for example, take into account, the likes of Tongard Hewlett in North Durban, right? It's and in a way, I think focusing on that duty aspect is a way really of transcending these kinds of public-private law dichotomies that exist.
Thank you, Thomas. But I have a suspicion that what you are suggesting, and I'm looking forward to hear Marius's response, might be slightly easier in terms of the rights that we already had. But I think several of the unenumerated rights are as important for the argument you are making, Marius, and that duty formulation might be slightly more difficult. An unenumerated right, usually in my view at least, has a very strong focus on the right. The duties are slightly more difficult to conceptualize and formulate. But respond, and once you are done, then we can have Peter and Maricel. Thanks.
Yeah, Tom, I think that's why I have this instinct that horizontality goes alongside all the other things that I'm discussing, and that I need to find a way of conceptually linking them. Because yes, my starting point has been that corporates already govern significant bits of urban space in bigger cities, and often entire towns in smaller cases. And from that reality, whilst I think private law is ironically better at recognizing that reality than public law is, and that's what interests me. But everything that you said something very interesting about the sort of informality of it all, and I've read this great book by Lawrence Piper and Fiona Anciano on Hope Bay in Cape Town, and where they say that when what they call City Hall loses control over or power over the governance of specific urban spaces, and I think this also links to Peter's question in the chat that I was reading as Tom was speaking, that the state surrenders power through its own lack of capacity to two sectors of society. It surrenders power to capital and it surrenders power to the informal sector. And then it gets especially tricky when those two coincide. In the case of transport governance in the taxi industry, for example, where the city, much as we now have this private-public transport matrix that's happening in the city, actually has preciously little control over it and preciously little hope in ever gaining control over it. And so what one then has to start thinking of is, well, how does one then, if the law is going to play a role in this at all, how does one then start developing those responsibilities in a very contextual, very sort of Section 8.2 applies if applicable sort of context, depending on the nature of the right, the nature of the duty kind of way. Yes, I mean, I know very well that I'm not answering any of these questions. I'm just reflecting on them.
No, you are doing so well, and that even having had the vaccination and all, I know that the energy levels must be depleting. But I would like to ask Peter, has your question been sufficiently answered? Would you like to add?
Yes,
largely, yes. I can see you nobly resisting the being sucked into the vortex of private law language, and rightly so, because this is not really where it belongs. And yet, I'm having that difficulty too, because how would our interested judge, except by using language to which a judge could relate? And so trying to borrow some concepts that might sort of lie in that space in between public and private law. And I'm not entirely clear whether it's two things operating simultaneously or whether it's a truly hybrid animal here. Anyway, that's more of a comment. Thank you very much for the presentation.
Thanks for that, Peter. Maurice, Maricel also has a question, and unless I'm seeing a hand, we will wrap up with her once you've answered her and perhaps responded to Peter as well. Maricel?
Thank you, Prof. Prof, that was an interesting discussion. Thank you so much. My question is whether the co-government idea is a good mechanism or suitable mechanism, and would it require a selection process? I'm thinking of, for instance, tender type processes, and how governments will ensure that the entities that they team up with is sufficient in the light of the mandates of local government.
Oh dear, I haven't thought of that at all. It's just expanded even more. But yes, everything that you say, except that I think that you are assuming that local governments, or I'm assuming the opposite. I'm sort of dealing with a scenario where the local government no longer has a choice as to who the co-governance partners are. What you say is that sometimes they do, and that we need to pay attention to that in those negotiations, and sort of, it's not only contract, it's also sort of memoranda of understanding and these sort of quasi-contract sort of spaces where there's quite a lot of opportunity in sort of bringing in sort of public law concepts that I haven't thought of. Peter, I'm glad that what you said was a comment rather than a question, because I can only nod. I think you're right, but I'm really struggling. And I think my struggle to articulate these obligations and these rights, if they are both sort of in a postmodern way, illustrates my point, which is that public law concepts and human rights language is sort of falling short in sort of grasping specifically what's at issue here. But thank you very much for all of this. I'm going to probably have to look at the recording afterwards and make some proper notes, and I'm going to use all of this, and I thank you in advance.
Maurice, thank you once again. The very last substantive comment. I recently, for my sins, had to read a little bit about socially responsible investment. There's also a whole body of scholarship around that, and you might also find some interesting pointers there from a human rights perspective. But that leaves me Marius, to thank you. You've generated, first of all, a very good turnout, much larger than what we usually have for these smaller coffee conversations of ours, which is a compliment to you. But you've also really generated, I think, a discussion that's going to make us think for longer. Even now when we say leave this meeting, this conversation will stick with us. So thank you very much. That's exactly what we attempt to do. And therefore, we are also happy to be able to share this recording because it's good. It's very good. And I think I don't want to thank the people who post questions on your behalf, but I would like to thank them from my behalf that they engaged, and we are grateful also for their participation. So thanks, everyone. For those belonging to the ELA, the next session is starting at 4 p.m. At this evening session. We'll see you there. But just before we go, I would like to thank the team behind the Critical Conversation series. It's a student team. Led by Dr. Nicoline Stein, Nicoline and Maricel and the rest of the team. Thank you very much for so professionally organizing these events. It's not going unseen. This was the last for the year, as I've mentioned. Next year, we will continue these conversations, hopefully in person. And then we will also ensure that there's coffee available. So thanks, team. Thanks again, Marius. And thank you for every participant. I'm wishing you a wonderful afternoon. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.